All right. Well, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whatever time it is, it's obviously bedtime, which means it's time for the next chapter of our story. Hopefully, I don't have a recurrence of what happened yesterday. I was gaming with some friends and some viewers and streaming in the Discord, and suddenly, there went my internet. Gone. Didn't come back for hours and hours and hours. And by then I had some family stuff for a bunch of family in town because the biological father's trying to pass away, maybe passing away, maybe stabilizing. I don't know. Seems like the answer changes every hour on the hour. Still haven't figured out how I feel about it. But yeah, I did get to see a whole bunch of my nieces and nephews yesterday, and that was pretty good. I got some big hugs. Big hugs are good. I was also reminded of why I don't let my mother cook for holidays and family gatherings anymore. Yeah. Mom, if you ever listen to this, I'm sorry, but it's bad. It's really bad. Yeah. Anyway, so hung out there for a while. It was good for a bit. It was good seeing some people. My youngest nephew got mad at his sister for something and unleashed a sonic attack that would not have been out of place in an X-Men comic. So, and then his older sister was completely unfazed and just kind of hopped and skipped back to the house as if nothing whatsoever had happened. Meanwhile, I was across the entire yard, the back deck, and I was wincing from the headache from that scream. I was not unfazed. But anyway, just kind of killing time before I get started, I guess. Little dude here yet, Bella? I know he was asking about it. I just found out that there's something called Bardcore, which is completely new to me. Found an hour of Eminem as though it were medieval. So it was like a bunch of the melody portions of Eminem's work, but done with medieval instruments, or at least faux medieval instruments. It's weird. Kind of cool, but weird. Well, that's a cool pattern. The Sisyphus has gone completely rogue. It no longer wants to take instruction. So it's like, screw you. I'm going to do whatever I want. You have no control. Tried to clear out the pattern before the stream, but it was having none of it. So, when we left off, the Red Fox, I think his name was Roy Campbell, had been killed right in front of David, and he was falsely implicated in the death by the lawyer that was there. So he had to flee. He ran into Alan Breck, and they've decided to flee to the south, back to the area of the country where David's actually from. in order to avoid being hunted. So we're on chapter 19, The House of Fear. Bit of an ominous name for it. Night fell as we were walking, and the clouds, which had broken up in the afternoon, settled in and thickened, so that it fell, for the season of the year, extremely dark. The way we went was over rough mountainsides, and though Alan pushed on with an assured manner, I could by no means see how he directed himself. At last, about 10:30 of the clock, we came to the top of a brae and saw lights below us. It seemed a house door stood open and let out a beam of fire and candlelight, and all round the house, and steadying 5 or 6 persons, were moving hurriedly about, each carrying a lighted brand. "James must have tint his wits," said Alan. "If this was the soldiers instead of you and me, he would be in a bonny mess. But I dare say he'll have a sentry on the road, and he would ken well enough no soldiers would find the way that we came." Hereupon he whistled 3 times in a particular manner. It was strange to see how, at the first sound of it, all the moving torches came to a stand, as if the bearers were affrighted, and how at the third the bustle began again as before. Having thus set folks' minds at rest, we came down the brae, and were met at the yard gate, for this place was like a well-doing farm, by a tall, handsome man of more than 50, who cried out to Alan in Gaelic. "James Stewart," said Alan, "I will ask you to speak in Scotch, for here is a young gentleman with me that has nane of the other. This is him," he added, putting his arm through mine. "A young gentleman of the Lowlands, and a lard in his country too, but I am thinking it will be the better for his health if we gave his name the go-by." James of the Glens turned to me for a moment, and greeted me courteously enough. The next he had turned to Alan. "This had been a dreadful accident," he cried. "It will bring trouble on the country," and he wrung his hands. "Hoot," said Alan, "you must take the sour with the sweet, man. Colin Roy is dead, and be thankful for that." "Aye," said James, "and by my troth, I wish he was alive again. It's all very fine to blow and boast beforehand, but now it's done, Alan, and who's to bear the wyte of it? The accident fell out in Appin. Mind you that, Alan. It's Appin that must pay, and I am a man that has a family." While this was going on, I looked about me at the servants. Some were on ladders, digging in the thatch of the house or the farm buildings, from which they brought out guns, swords, and different weapons of war. Others carried them away, and by the sound of mattock blows from somewhere farther down the brae, I suppose they buried them. Though they were all so busy, there prevailed no kind of order in their efforts. Men struggled together for the same gun, and ran into each other with their burning torches, and James was continually turning about from his talk with Alan to cry out orders which were apparently never understood. The faces in the torchlight were like those of people overborne with hurry and panic, and though none spoke above his breath, their speech sounded both anxious and angry. It was about this time that a lassie came out of the house, carrying a pack or bundle, and it has often made me smile to think how Alan's instinct awoke at the mere sight of it. "What's that the lassie has?" he asked. "We're just setting the house in order, Alan," said James, in his frightened and somewhat fawning way. "They'll search Appin with candles, and we must have all things straight. We're digging the bit guns and swords into the moss, you see, and these, I'm thinking, will be your own French clothes. We'll be to bury them, I believe." "Bury my French clothes?" cried Alan. "Troth, no." And he laid hold upon the packet, and retired into the barn to shift himself, recommending me in the meanwhile to his kinsman. James carried me accordingly into the kitchen, and sat down with me at table, smiling and talking at first in a very hospitable manner. But presently the gloom returned upon him. He sat frowning and biting his fingers, only remembered me from time to time, and then gave me but a word or two and a poor smile, and back into his private terrors. His wife sat by the fire and wept, with her face in her hands. The eldest son was crouched upon the floor, running over a great mass of papers, and now and again setting one alight and burning it to the bitter end. All the while a servant lass with a red face was rummaging about the room, in a blind hurry of fear, and whimpering as she went. And every now and again one of the men would thrust in his face from the yard and cry for orders. At last James could keep his seat no longer, and begged my permission to be so unmannerly as walk about. I am but poor company altogether, sir, said he, but I can think of nothing but this dreadful accident, and the trouble it is like to bring upon quite innocent persons. A little after, he observed his son burning a paper which he thought should have been kept, and at that his excitement burst out so that it was painful to witness. He struck the lad repeatedly. "Are you gone gait?" he cried. "Do you wish to hang your father?" And forgetful of my presence, carried on at him a long time together in the Gaelic, the young man answering nothing, only the wife, at the name of hanging, throwing her apron over her face and sobbing out louder than before. "Hey, Panda, I'm glad you're here." This was all wretched for a stranger like myself to hear and see, and I was right glad when Alan returned, looking like himself in his fine French clothes, though, to be sure, they were now grown almost too battered and withered to deserve the name of fine. I was then taken out in my turn by another of the sons, and given that change of clothing of which I had stood so long in need, and a pair of Highland brogues made of deer leather, rather strange at first, but after a little practice, very easy to the feet. By the time I came back, Alan must have told his story, for it seemed understood that I was to fly with him, and they were all busy upon our equipment. They gave us each a sword and pistols, though I professed my inability to use the former, and with these and some ammunition, a bag of oatmeal, an iron pan, and a bottle of right French brandy, we were ready for the heather. Money indeed was lacking. I had about 2 guineas left. Alan's belt having been dispatched by another hand, that trusty messenger had no more than 17 pence to his whole fortune. And as for James, it appeared he had brought himself so low with journeys to Edinburgh and legal expenses on behalf of the tenants that he could only scrape together 3 and 5 pence halfpenny, the most of it in coppers. "This'll no do," said Alan. "You must find a safe bit somewhere nearby," said James, "and get word sent to me. You see, you'll have to get this business prettily off, Alan. This is no time to be stayed for a guinea or two. They're sure to get wind of you, sure to seek ye, and by my way of it, sure to lay on ye the white of this day's accident. If it falls on you, it falls on me that am your near kinsman, and harboured you when you were in the country. And if it comes on me," he paused, and bit his fingers, with a white face, "it would be a painful thing for our friends if I was to hang," said he. "It would be an ill day for Appin," said Alan. "It's a day that sticks in my throat," said James. "Oh, man, Alan, you and me have spoken like 2 fools," he cried, striking his hand upon the wall so that the house rang again. "Well, and that's true, too," said Alan. "And my friend from the Lowlands here," nodding at me. "Hey, Meg, thanks for coming in. Thanks for the lurk." "And my friend from the Lowlands here," nodding at me, "gave me a good word upon that head, if I would only have listened to him. But see here," said James, returning to his former manner. "If they lay me by the heels, Alan, then it's that you'll be needing the money. For with all that I have said and that you have said, it will look very black against the 2 of us. Do you mark that? Well, follow me out, and you'll see that I have to get a paper out against myself. I'll have to offer a reward for you. I. It's a sore thing to do between such near friends, but if I get the deardom of this dreadful accident, I'll have to fend for myself, man. Do you see that?" He spoke with a pleading earnestness, taking Alan by the breast of the coat. "Aye," said Alan, "I see that. And you'll have to be clear of the country, Alan. Aye, and clear of Scotland. You and your friend from the Lowlands, too. For I'll have to paper your friend from the Lowlands. You see that, Alan? Say that you see that." I thought Alan flushed a bit. "This is unco hard on me that brought him here, James," said he, throwing his head back. "It's like making me a traitor." "Now, Alan, man," cried James, "look things in the face. He'll be papered anyway. Mungo Campbell will be sure to paper him. What matters if I paper him too? And then, Alan, I am a man that has a family." And then after a little pause on both sides, "And, Alan, it'll be a jury of Campbells," said he. "There's one thing," said Alan, musingly, "that naebody kens his name." "Nor yet they shall, Alan. There's my hand on that," cried James, for all the world as if he had really known my name, and was foregoing some advantage. "But just the habit he was in, and what he looked like, and his age, and the like, I couldna well do less." "I wonder at your father's son," cried Alan, sternly. "Would you sell the lad with a gift? Would you change his clothes and then betray him?" No, Alan," said James. No. The habit he took off. The habit Mungo saw him in." But I thought he seemed crestfallen, Indeed, he was clutching at every straw, and all the time, I dare say, saw the faces of his hereditary foes on the bench, and in the jury box and the gallows in the background. "Well, sir," says Allen, turning to me, "what say you to that? You are here under the safeguard of my honor, and it's my part to see nothing done but what shall please you." "I have but one word to say," said I, "for to all this dispute I am a perfect stranger. But the plain common sense is to set the blame where it belongs, and that is on the man that fired the shot. Paper him, as you call it. Set the hunt on him, and let honest, innocent folk show their faces in safety." But at this both Allen and James cried out in horror, bidding me hold my tongue, for that was not to be thought of, and asking me what the Camerons would think, which confirmed me it must have been a Cameron from Mamor that did the act, and if I did not see that the lad might be caught. "You haven't surely thought of that," said they, with such innocent earnestness that my hands dropped at my side, and I despaired of argument. "Very well, then," said I. "Paper me if you please. Paper Allen. Paper King George. We're all three innocent, and that seems to be what's wanted. But at least, sir," said I to James, recovering from my little fit of annoyance, "I am Allen's friend, and if I can be helpful to friends of his, I will not stumble at the risk." I thought it best to put a fair face on my consent, for I saw Allen troubled, and besides, thinks I to myself, as soon as my back is turned, they will paper me, as they call it, whether I consent or not. But in this I saw I was wrong, for I had no sooner said the words than Mrs. Stewart leaped out of her chair, came running over to us, and wept first upon my neck, and then on Allen's, blessing God for our goodness to her family. "As for you, Allen, it was no more than your bounden duty," she said, "but for this lad that has come here, and seen us at our worst, and seen the good man fleeching like a suitor, him that by right should give his commands like any king. As for you, my lad," she says, "my heart is way not to have your name, but I have your face, and as long as my heart beats under my bosom, I will keep it, and think of it, and bless it." And with that she kissed me, and burst once more into such sobbing that I stood abashed. "Hoot, hoot," said Allen, looking mighty silly. "The day comes unco soon in this month of July, and tomorrow there'll be a fine to-do in Appin, a fine riding of dragoons, and the crying of crock and running of redcoats, and it behooves you and me the sooner be gone." Thereupon we said farewell, and set out again, bending somewhat eastwards, in a fine, mild, dark night, and over much the same broken country as before. Chapter 20. The Flight in the Heather. The Rocks. Sometimes we walked, sometimes ran, and as it drew on to morning, walked ever the less, and ran the more. Though upon its face that country appeared to be a desert, yet there were huts and houses of the people, of which we must have passed more than 20, hidden in quiet places of the hills. When we came to one of these, Allen would lead me in the way, and go himself and rap upon the side of the house, and speak a while at the window with some sleeper awakened. This was to pass the news, which in that country was so much of a duty that Allen must pause to attend to it, even while fleeing for his life, and so well attended to by others, that in more than half of the houses where we called they had heard already of the murder. And the others, as well as I could make out, standing back at a distance and hearing a strange tongue, the news was received with more of consternation than surprise. For all our hurry, day began to come in while we were still far from any shelter. It found us in a prodigious valley, strewn with rocks, and where ran a foaming river. Wild mountains stood around it. There grew there neither grass nor trees, and I have sometimes thought since then that it may have been the valley called Glencoe, where the massacre was in the time of King William. But for the details of our itinerary, I am all to seek, our way lying now by short cuts, now by great detours, our pace being so hurried, our time of journeying usually by night, and the name of such places as I asked and heard being in the Gaelic tongue, and the more easily forgotten. The first peep of morning, then, showed us this horrible place, and I could see Allen knit his brow. "This is no fit place for you and me," he said. "This is a place they're bound to watch." And with that he ran harder than ever down to the waterside, in a part where the river was split in two among 3 rocks. It went through with a horrid thundering that made my belly quake, and there hung over the linn a little mist of spring, of spray. Alan looked neither to the right nor to the left, but jumped clean upon the middle rock, and fell there on his hands and knees to check himself, for that rock was small, and he might have pitched over on the far side. I had scarce time to measure the distance, or to understand the peril before I had followed him, and he had caught and stopped me. So there we stood, side by side upon a small rock, slippery with spray, a far broader leap in front of us, and the river dinning upon all sides. When I saw where I was, there came on me a deadly sickness of fear, and I put my hand over my eyes. Alan took me and shook me. I saw he was speaking, but the roaring of the falls and the trouble of my mind prevented me from hearing. Only I saw his face was red with anger, and that he stamped upon the rock. The same look showed me the water raging by, and the mist hanging in the air, and with that I covered my eyes again and shuddered. The next minute Alan had set the brandy bottle to my lips, and forced me to drink about a gill, which sent the blood into my head again. Then, putting his hands to his mouth, and his mouth to my ear, he shouted, "Hang or drown!" and turning his back upon me, leaped over the farther branch of the stream, and landed safe. I was now alone upon the rock, which gave me the more room. The brandy was singing in my ears. I had this good example fresh before me, and just wit enough to see that if I did not leap at once, I should never leap at all. I bent low on my knees, and flung myself forth with that kind of anger of despair that has sometimes stood me instead of courage. Sure enough, it was but my hands that reached the full length. These slipped, caught again, slipped again, and I was slithering back into the linn when Alan seized me, first by the hair, then by the collar, and with a great strain dragged me into safety. Never a word he said, but set off running again for his life, and I must stagger to my feet and run after him. I had been weary before, but now I was sick and bruised, and partly drunken with the brandy. I kept stumbling as I ran. I had a stitch that came near to overmaster me, and when at last Alan paused under a great rock that stood there among a number of others, it was none too soon for David Balfour. A great rock, I have said, but by rights it was two rocks leaning together at the top, both some 20 feet high, and at the first sight inaccessible. Even Alan, though you may say he is as good as four hands, failed twice in an attempt to climb them, and it was only at the third trial, and then by standing on my shoulders and leaping up with such force as I thought must have broken my collarbone, that he secured a lodgment. Once there, he let down his leathern girdle, and with the aid of that and a pair of shallow footholds in the rock, I scrambled up beside him. Then I saw why we had come there, for the two rocks, being both somewhat hollow on the top, and sloping one to the other, made a kind of dish or saucer, where as many as 3 or 4 men might have lain hidden. All this while Alan had not said a word, and had run and climbed with such a savage, silent frenzy of hurry, that I knew that he was in mortal fear of some miscarriage. Even now we were on the rock, he said nothing, nor so much as relaxed the frowning look upon his face, but clapped flat down, and keeping only one eye above the edge of our place of shelter, scouted all round the compass. The dawn had come quite clear. We could see the stony sides of the valley, and its bottom, which was bestrewed with rocks, and the river which went from one side to another, and made white falls, but nowhere the smoke of a house, nor any living creature but some eagles screaming round a cliff. Then at last Alan smiled. "Aye," said he, "now we have a chance," and then looking at me with some amusement, "You're no very gleg at the jumping," said he. At this I suppose I coloured with mortification, for he added at once, "Hoots, small blame to ye. To be feared of a thing and yet to do it is what makes the prettiest kind of man. And then there was water there, and water's a thing that dauntens even me." "No, no," said Alan, "it's no you that's to blame. It's me." I asked him why. "Why," said he, "I have proved myself a Gomeril this night. For first of all I take a wrong road, and that in my own country of Appin, so that the day has caught us where we should never have been. And thanks to that, we lie here in some danger and mire discomfort. And next, which is the worst of the two, for a man that has been so much among the heathers myself, I have come wanting a water bottle, and here we lie for a long summer's day, with naething but neat spirit. Ye may think that a small matter, but before it comes night, David, you'll give me news of it." I was anxious to redeem my character and offered, if he would pour out the brandy, to run down and fill the bottle at the river. I would not waste the good spirit either, says he. It's been a good friend to you this night, or, in my poor opinion, you would still be caulking on yon stone. And what's more, says he, you may have observed, you that's a man of so much penetration, that Alan Breck Stewart was perhaps walking quicker than his ordinar. You, I cried, you were running fit to burst. Was I so, said he. Well then, you may depend upon it, that there was nae time to be lost. And now, here's enough said. Gang ye to your sleep, lad, and I'll watch. Accordingly, I laid down to sleep. A little peaty earth had drifted in between the top of the two rocks, and some bracken grew there to be a bed to me. The last thing I heard was still the crying of the eagles. I dare say it would be 9 a.m. when I was roughly awakened, and found Alan's hand pressed upon my mouth. Whisht, he whispered, you were snoring. Well, said I, surprised at his anxious and dark face, and why not? He peered over the edge of the rock, and signed me to do the like. It was now high day, cloudless and very hot. The valley was as clear as in a picture. About half a mile up the water was a camp of redcoats. A big fire blazed in their midst, at which some were cooking, and nearby, on the top of a rock about as high as ours, there stood a sentry, with the sun sparkling on his arms. All the way down along the riverside were posted other sentries. Here near together, they're widely scattered, some planted like the first, on places of command, some on the ground level, and marching and countermarching, so as to meet halfway. Higher up the glen, where the ground was more open, the chain of posts was continued by horse soldiers, whom we could see in the distance riding to and fro. Lower down, the infantry continued, but as the stream was suddenly swelled by the confluence of considerable burn, they were more widely set, and only watched the fords and stepping stones. I took but one look at them, and ducked again into my place. It was strange indeed to see this valley, which had lain so solitary in the hour of dawn, bristling with arms and dotted with the red coats and breeches. You see, said Alan, this was what I was afraid of, Davy, that they would watch the burnside. They began to come in about 2 hours ago, and man, but you're a grand hand at the sleeping. We're in a narrow place. If they get up the sides of the hill, they could easy spy us with a glass. But if they'll only keep in the foot of the valley, we'll do yet. The posts are thinner down the water, and come night, we'll try our hand at getting by them. And what are we to do till night? I asked. Lie here, says he, and bursel. That one good Scotch word, bursel, was indeed the most of the story of the day that we had now to pass. Means toast hard. You are to remember that we lay on the bare top of a rock, like scones upon a girdle. The sun beat upon us cruelly. The rock grew so heated a man could scarcely endure the touch of it, and the little patch of earth and fern which kept cooler was only large enough for one at a time. We took turns about to lie on the naked rock, which was indeed like the position of that saint that was martyred on a gridiron, and it ran in my mind how strange it was that in the same climate, and at only a few days' distance, I should have suffered so cruelly, first from cold upon my island, and now from heat upon this rock. All the while we had no water, only raw brandy for a drink, which was worse than nothing, but we kept the bottle as cool as we could, burying it in the earth, and got some relief by bathing our breasts and temples. The soldiers kept stirring all day in the bottom of the valley, now changing guard, now in patrolling parties hunting among the rocks. These lay round in so great a number that to look for men among them was like looking for a needle in a bottle of hay, and being so hopeless a task, it was gone about with the less care. Yet we could see the soldiers pike their bayonets among the heather, which sent a cold thrill into my vitals, and they would sometimes hang about our rock, so that we scarce dared to breathe. It was in this way that I first heard the right English speech, one fellow, as he went by, actually clapping his hand upon the sunny face of the rock on which we lay, and plucking it off again with an oath. I tell you it's 'ot, said he, and I was amazed at the clipping tones and the odd sing-song in which he spoke, and no less at that strange trick of dropping out the letter H. To be sure, I had heard Ransom, but he had taken his ways from all sorts of people, and spoke so imperfectly at the best that I set down the most of it to childishness. My surprise was all the greater to hear that manner of speaking in the mouth of a grown man, and indeed I have never grown used to it, nor yet altogether with the English grammar, as perhaps a very critical eye might here and there spy out even in these memoirs. The tediousness and pain of these hours upon the rock grew only the greater as the day went on, the rock getting still the hotter, and the sun fiercer. There were giddiness and sickness, and sharp pangs like rheumatism to be supported. I minded then, and have often minded since, on the lines in our Scotch psalm, "The moon by night thee shall not smite, nor yet the sun by day." And indeed, it was only by God's blessing that we were neither of us sun-smitten. At last, about 2, it was beyond men's hearing, and there was now temptation to resist, as well as pain to thole. For the sun, being now got a little into the west, there came a patch of shade on the east side of our rock, which was the side sheltered from the soldiers. "As well one death as another," said Allen, and slipped over the edge and dropped on the ground on the shadowy side. I followed him at once, and instantly fell all my length, so weak was I, and so giddy with that long exposure. Here, then, we lay for an hour or two, aching from head to foot, as weak as water, and lying quite naked to the eye of any soldier who should have strolled that way. None came, however, all passing by on the other side, so that our rock continued to be our shield, even in this new position. Presently we began again to get a little strength, and as the soldiers were now lying closer along the riverside, Allen proposed that we should try a start. I was by this time afraid of but one thing in the world, and that was to be set back upon the rock. Anything else was welcome to me. So we got ourselves at once in marching order, and began to slip from rock to rock, one after the other, now crawling flat on our bellies in the shade, now making a run for it, heart in mouth. The soldiers, having searched this side of the valley after a fashion, and being perhaps somewhat sleepy with the sultriness of the afternoon, had now laid by much of their vigilance, and stood dozing at their posts, or only keeping a lookout along the banks of the river. So in this way, keeping down the valley, and at the same time toward the mountains, we drew steadily away from their neighborhood. But the business was the most wearying I had ever taken part in. A man had need of 100 eyes in every part of him, to keep concealed in that uneven country, and within cry of so many and scattered sentries. When we must pass an open place, quickness was not all, but a swift judgment not only of the lie of the whole country, but of the solidity of every stone on which we must set foot. For the afternoon was now fallen so breathless that the rolling of a pebble sounded abroad like a pistol shot, and would start the echo calling among the hills and cliffs. By sundown we had made some distance, even by our slow rate of progress, though to be sure the sentry on the rock was still plainly in our view. But now we came on something that put all fears out of season, and that was a deep, rushing burn that tore down in that part to join the Glen River. At the sight of this, we cast ourselves on the ground and plunged head and shoulders in the water, and I cannot tell which was the more pleasant, the great shock as the cool stream went over us, or the greed with which we drank it. We lay there, for the banks hit us, drank again and again, bathed our chests, let our wrists trail in the running water till they ached with the chill, and at last, being wonderfully renewed, we got out the meal bag and made drammach in the iron pan. This, though it is but cold water mingled with oatmeal, yet makes a good enough dish for a hungry man, and where there are no means of making fire, or, as in our case, good reason for not making one, it is the chief standby of those who have taken to the heather. As soon as the shadow of the night had fallen, we set forth again, at first with the same caution, but presently with more boldness, standing our full height and stepping out at a good place of walking. The way was very intricate, lying up the steep sides of mountains and along the brows of cliffs. Clouds had come in with the sunset, and the night was dark and cool, so that I walked without much fatigue, but in continual fear of falling and rolling down the mountains, and with no guess at our direction. The moon rose at last, and found us still on the road. It was in its last quarter, and was long beset with clouds, but after a while shone out and showed me many dark heads of mountains, and was reflected far underneath us on the narrow arm of a sea loch. At this sight we both paused, I struck with wonder to find myself so high and walking, as it seemed to me, upon clouds. Alan to make sure of his direction. Seemingly he was well pleased, and he must certainly have judged us out of earshot of all our enemies, for throughout the rest of our night march he beguiled the way with whistling of many tunes, warlike, merry, plaintive, real tunes that made the foot go faster, tunes of my own south country that made me fain to be home from my adventures, and all these on the great dark desert mountains, making company upon the way. The flate and the heather, the hue of Corinake. Early as day comes in the beginning of July, it was still dark when we reached our destination, a cleft in the head of a great mountain with a water running through the midst, and upon the one hand a shallow cave in a rock. Birches grew there in a thin, pretty wood, which a little farther on was changed into a wood of pines. The burn was full of trout, the wood of cushat doves. On the open side of the mountain beyond, wops would be heard always whistling, and cuckoos were plentiful. From the mouth of the cleft we looked down upon a part of Mamor, and on the sea loch that divides that country from Appin, and this from so great a height as made it my continual wonder and pleasure to sit and behold them. The name of the cleft was the Hue of Corinake, and although from its height and being so near upon the sea, it was often beset with clouds, yet it was on the whole a pleasant place, and the 5 days we lived in it went happily. We slept in the cave, making our bed of heather bushes, which we cut for that purpose, and covering ourselves with Alan's greatcoat. There was a low concealed place in a turning of the glen where we were so bold as to make fire, so that we could warm ourselves when the clouds set in, and cook hot porridge, and grill the little trouts that we caught with our hands under the stones and overhanging banks of the burn. This was indeed our chief pleasure in business, and not only to save our meal against worse times, but with a rivalry that much amused us. We spent a great part of our days at the waterside, stripped to the waist, and groping about, or, as they say, guddling for these fish. The largest we got might have been 1/4 of a pound, but they were of good flesh and flavor, and when broiled upon the coals, lacked only a little salt to be delicious. In any by time Alan must teach me to use my sword, for my ignorance had much distressed him, and I think besides, as I had sometimes the upper hand of him in the fishing, he was not sorry to turn to an exercise where he had so much the upper hand of me. He made it somewhat more of a pain than need have been, for he stormed at me all through the lessons in a very violent manner of scolding, and would push me so close that I made sure he must run me through the body. I was often tempted to turn tail, but held my ground for all that, and got some profit of my lessons, if it was but to stand on guard with an assured countenance, which is often all that is required. So though I could never in the least please my master, I was not altogether displeased with myself. In the meanwhile, you are not to suppose that we neglected our chief business, which was to get away. It will be many a long day, Alan said to me on our first morning, before the redcoats think upon seeking Corinake. So now we must get word sent to James, and he must find the siller for us. And how shall we send word, says I? We are here in a desert place, which yet we dare not leave, and unless you get the fowls of the air to be your messengers, I see not what we shall be able to do. Aye, said Alan, you're a man of small contrivance, David. Thereupon he fell in a muse, looking in the embers of the fire, and presently, getting a piece of wood, he fashioned it in a cross, the 4 ends of which he blackened on the coals. Then he looked at me a little shyly. Could you lend me my button, says he. It seems a strange thing to ask a gift again, but I own I am loath to cut another. I gave him the button, whereupon he strung it on a strip of his greatcoat, which he had used to bind the cross, and tying in a little sprig of birch and another of fir, he looked upon his work with satisfaction. Now, said he, there is a little clachan, which is called a hamlet in the English, not very far from Corinake, and it has the name of Coalisnacocon. Sorry, some of these are pretty tough. There are living many friends of mine whom I could trust with my life, and some that I am not so that I am no just so sure of. You see, David, there will be money set upon our heads. James himself is to set money on them, and as for the Campbells, they would never spare siller where there is a Stuart to be hurt. If it was otherwise, I would go down to Colas na Cocon, whatever, and trust my life into these people's hands as lightly as I would trust another with my glove. But being so, said I. Being so, said he, I wad as lief they didna see me. There's bad folk everywhere, and what's far worse, weak ones. So when it comes dark again, I will steal down into that clachan, and set this, what I have been making, in the window of a good friend of mine, John Breck MacColl, a bowman of Appins. Yeah, it is pretty cool, Sparky. I like it. Also, welcome. Glad you could make it for the stream. I am getting my ass kicked by Scottish naming conventions. With all my heart, says I, and if he finds it, what is he to think? Well, says Allan, I wish he was a man of more penetration, for by my troth I am afraid he will make little enough of it. But this is what I have in mind. This cross is something in the nature of cross terri, or fiery cross, which is the signal of gathering in our clans. Yet he will know well enough the clan is not to rise, for there it is standing in his window, and no word with it. So he will say to himself, the clan is not to rise, but there is something. Then he will see my button, and that was Duncan Stewart's. And then he will say to himself, the son of Duncan is in the heather and has need of me. Well, said I, it may be, but even supposing so, there is a good deal of heather between here and the Forth. And that is a very true word, said Allan. But then John Breck will see the sprig of birch and the sprig of pine, and he will say to himself, if he is a man of any penetration at all, which I misdoubt, Allan will be lying in a wood which is both of pines and birches. Then he will think to himself, that is not so very rife hereabout, and then he will come and give us a look up in Corrynakie. And if he does not, David, the devil may fly away with him for what I care, for he will no be worth the salt to his porridge. Eh, man, said I, drolling with him a little, you're very ingenious, but would it not be simpler for you to write him a few words in black and white? And that is an excellent observe, Mr. Balfour of Shaw's, says Allan, drolling with me, and it would certainly be much simpler for me to write to him, but it would be a sore job for John Breck to read it. He would have to go to the school for 2-3 years, and it's possible we might be wearied waiting on him. So that night, Allan carried down his fiery cross and set it in the bowman's window. He was troubled when he came back, for the dogs had barked and the folk run out from their houses, and he thought he had heard a clatter of arms and seen a redcoat come to one of the doors. On all accounts, we lay the next day in the borders of the wood and kept a close lookout, so that if it was John Breck that came, we might be ready to guide him, and if it was the redcoats, we should have time to get away. About noon, a man was to be spied, straggling up the open side of the mountains in the sun, and looking round him as he came from under his hand. No sooner had Allan seen him than he whistled. The man turned and came a little toward us. Then Allan would give another peep, and the man would come still nearer, and so by the sound of whistling he was guided to the spot where we lay. He was a ragged, wild, bearded man, about 40, grossly disfigured with the smallpox, and looked both dull and savage. Although his English was very bad and broken, yet Allan, according to his very handsome use, whenever I was by, would suffer him to speak no Gaelic. Perhaps the strange language made him appear more backward than he really was, but I thought he had little good will to serve us, and what he had was the child of terror. Allan would have him carry a message to James, but the bowman would hear of no message. She was forget it, he said in his screaming voice, and would either have a letter or wash his hands of us. I thought Allan would be gravelled at that, for we lacked the means of writing in that desert. But he was a man of more resources than I knew, searched the wood until he found the quill of a cushat dove, which he shaped into a pen, made himself a kind of ink with gunpowder from his horn and water from the running stream, and tearing a corner from his French military commission, which he carried in his pocket like a talisman to keep from the gallows, he sat down and wrote as follows. Dear kinsman, please send the money by the bearer to the place he kens of. Your affectionate cousin, A.S. This he entrusted to the bowman, who promised to make what manner of speed he best could, and carried it off with him down the hill. He was full 3 days gone, but about 5 in the evening of the third, we heard a whistling in the wood, which Allen answered, and presently the booman came up the waterside, looking for us right and left. He seemed less sulky than before, and indeed he was no doubt well pleased to have got to the end of such a dangerous commission. He gave us news of the country, that it was alive with redcoats, that arms were being found, and poor folk brought in trouble daily, and that James and some of his servants were already clapped in prison at Fort William, under strong suspicion of complicity. It seemed it was noised on all sides that Alan Breck had fired the shot, and there was a bill issued for both him and me, with £100 reward. This was all as bad as could be, and the little note the booman had carried us from Mrs. Stewart was of a miserable sadness. In it she besought Alan not to let himself be captured, assuring him, if he fell in the hands of the troops, both he and James were no better than dead men. The money she had sent was all that she could beg or borrow, and she prayed heaven we could be doing with it. Lastly, she said, she enclosed us one of the bills in which we were described. This we looked upon with great curiosity, and not a little fear, partly as a man may look in a mirror, partly as he may look in the barrel of an enemy's gun to judge if it be truly aimed. Alan was advertised as a small, pock-marked, active man of 35 or thereby, dressed in a feathered hat, a French side coat of blue with silver buttons, and lace a great deal tarnished, a red waistcoat and breeches of black shag, and I as a tall, strong lad of about 18, wearing an old blue coat, very ragged, an old Highland bonnet, a long homespun waistcoat, blue breeches, his legs bare, low country shoes, wanting the toes, speaks like a lowlander, and has no beard. Alan was well enough pleased to see his finery so fully remembered and set down. Only when he came to the word tarnish, he looked upon his lace like one a little mortified. As for myself, I thought I cut a miserable figure in the bill, and yet was well enough pleased too, for since I had changed these rags, the description had ceased to be a danger, and become a source of safety. Alan, said I, you should change your clothes. Na troth, said Alan, I have nae others. A fine sight I would be if I went back to France in a bonnet. This put a second reflection in my mind, that if I were to separate from Alan in his telltale clothes, I should be safe against arrest, and might go openly about my business. Nor was this all, for suppose I was arrested when I was alone, there was little against me, but suppose I was taken in company with the reputed murderer, my case would begin to be grave. For generosity's sake, I dare not speak my mind upon this head, but I thought of it none the less. I thought of it all the more, too, when the booman brought out a green purse with 4 guineas in gold, and the best part of another in small change. True, it was more than I had, but then Alan, with less than 5 guineas, had to get as far as France. I, with my less than 2, not beyond Queensferry, so that taking things in their proportion, Alan's society was not only a peril to my life, but a burden on my purse. But there was no thought of the sort in the honest head of my companion. He believed he was serving, helping, and protecting me. And what could I do but hold my peace, and chafe, and take my chance of it? It's little enough, said Alan, putting the purse in his pocket, but it'll do my business. And now, John Breck, if you'll hand over my button, this gentleman and me will be for taking the road. But the booman, after feeling about in a hairy purse that hung in front of him in the Highland manner, though he wore otherwise the lowland habit with sea trousers, began to roll his eyes strangely, and at last said, Our Nansel will lost it, meaning he thought he had lost it. What? Cried Alan. You will lose my button that was my father's before me? Now I will tell you what is in my mind, John Breck. It is in my mind. This is the worst day's work that ever you did since you was born. And as Alan spoke, he set his hands on his knees and looked at the booman with a smiling mouth, and that dancing light in his eyes that meant mischief to his enemies. Perhaps the booman was honest enough. Perhaps he had meant to cheat, and then, finding himself alone with the two of us in a desert place, cast back to honesty as being safer. At least, and all at once, he seemed to find that button and hand it to Alan. Well, and it is a good thing for the honor of the McColls, said Alan, and then to me, Here is my button back again, and I thank you for parting with it, which is of a piece with all your friendships to me. Then he took the warmest parting of the boomen. For, says he, ye have done very well by me, and set your neck at a venture, and I will always give you the name of a good man. Lastly, the booman took himself off by one way, and Allen and I, getting our chattels together, struck into another to resume our flight. Chapter 22. The Flight in the Heather, the Moor. Some 7 hours incessant, hard traveling brought us early in the morning to the end of a range of mountains. In front of us there lay a piece of low, broken desert land, which we must now cross. The sun was not long up, and shone straight in our eyes. A little thin mist went up from the face of the moorland like a smoke, so that, as Allen said, there might have been 20 squadron of dragoons there, and we none the wiser. We sat down, therefore, in a howe of the hillside, till the mist should have risen, and made ourselves a dish of drammach, and held a council of war. David, said Allen, this is the kittle bit. Shall we lie here till it comes night, or shall we risk it and stave on ahead? Well, said I am tired indeed, but I could walk as far again if that was all. Ay, but it isna, said Allen, nor yet the half. This is how we stand. Appin's fair death to us. To the south it's all Campbell's, and no to be thought of. To the north, well, there's no muckle to be gained by going north, neither for you that wants to get to Queensferry, nor yet for me that wants to get to France. Well then, we can strike east. East be it, says I, quite cheerily. But I was thinking into myself, oh man, if you would only take one point of the compass and let me take any other, it would be the best for both of us. Well then, east, you see, we have the moors, said Allen. Once there, David, it's mere pitch and toss. Out on yon bald, naked, flat place, where can a body turn to? Let the redcoats come over a hill. They can spy you miles away, and the sorrow's in their horses' heels. They would soon ride you down. It's no good place, David, and I'm free to say it's worse by daylight than by dark. Allen, said I, here's my way of it. Appin's death for us. We have none too much money, nor yet meal. The longer they seek, the nearer they may guess where we are. It's all a risk, and I give my word to go ahead until we drop. Allen was delighted. There are whiles, said he, when you are altogether too canny and wiggish to be company for a gentleman like me. But there comes other whiles when you show yourself a metal spark, and it's then, David, that I love you like a brother. The mist rose and died away, and showed us that country lying as waste as the sea, only the moorfowl and the peewees crying upon it, and far over to the east a herd of deer moving like dots. Much of it was red with heather, much of the rest broken up with bogs and hags and peaty pools. Some had been burnt black in a heath fire, and in another place there was quite a forest of dead firs standing like skeletons. A wearier-looking desert man never saw, but at least it was clear of troops, which was our point. We went down accordingly into the waste, and began to make our toilsome and devious travel toward the eastern verge. There were the tops of mountains all round, you are to remember, from whence we might be spied at any moment, so it behooved us to keep in the hollow parts of the moor, and when these turned aside from our direction, to move upon its naked face with infinite care. Sometimes, for half an hour together, we must crawl from one heather bush to another, as hunters do when they are hard upon the deer. It was a clear day again, with a blazing sun. The water in the brandy bottle was soon gone, and altogether, if I had guessed what it would be to crawl half the time upon my belly, and to walk much of the rest stooping nearly to the knees, I should certainly have held back from such a killing enterprise. Toiling and resting and toiling again, we wore away the morning, and about noon lay down in a thick bush of heather to sleep. Allen took the first watch, and it seemed to me that I had scarce closed my eyes before I was shaken up to take the second. We had no clock to go by, and Allen stuck a sprig of heath in the ground to serve instead, so that as soon as the shadow of the bush should fall so far to the east, I might know to rouse him. But I was by this time so weary that I could have slept 12 hours at a stretch. I had the taste of sleep in my throat. My joints slept even when my mind was waking. The hot smell of the heather and the drone of the wild bees were like possets to me, and every now and again I would give a jump and find that I had been dozing. The last time I woke, I seemed to come back from farther away, and thought the sun had taken a great start in the heavens. I looked at the sprig of heather, and at that I could have cried aloud, for I saw I had betrayed my trust. My head was nearly turned with fear and shame, and at what I saw when I looked around me on the moor, my heart was like dying in my body. For sure enough, a body of horse soldiers had come down during my sleep, and were drawing nearer to us from the southeast, spread out in the shape of a fan, and riding their horses to and fro in the deep parts of the heather. When I waked Alan, he glanced first at the soldiers, then at the mark with the position of the sun, and knitted his brows with a sudden quick look, both ugly and anxious, which was all the reproach I had of him. "What are we to do now?" I asked. "We'll have to play at being hares," said he. "Do you see yon mountain?" pointing to the one on the northeastern sky. "Aye," said I. "Well then," says he, "let us strike for that. Its name is Ben Alder. It is a wild desert mountain, full of hills and hollows, and if we can win to it before the morn, we may do yet." "But Alan," cried I, "they will take us across the very coming of the soldiers." "I ken that fine," said he, "but if we are driven back on Appin, we are two dead men. So now, David man, be brisk." With that he began to run forward on his hands and knees with an incredible quickness, as though it were his natural way of going. All the time, too, he kept winding in and out in the lower parts of the moorland, where we were the best concealed. Some of these had been burned, or at least scathed with fire, and there rose in our faces, which were close to the ground, a blinding, choking dust as fine as smoke. The water was long out, and this posture of running on the hands and knees brings an overmastering weakness and weariness, so that the joints ache and the wrists faint under your weight. Now and then, indeed, where there was a big bush of heather, we lay a while, and panted, and putting aside the leaves, looked back at the dragoons. They had not spied us, for they held straight on, a half-troop, I think, covering about 2 miles of ground, and beating it mighty thoroughly as they went. I had awakened just in time. A little later, and we must have fled in front of them, instead of escaping on one side. Even as it was, the least misfortune might betray us, and now and again, when a grouse rose out of the heather with a clap of wings, we lay as still as the dead and were afraid to breathe. The aching and faintness of my body, the laboring of my heart, the soreness of my hands, and the smarting of my throat and eyes, and the continual smoke of dust and ashes, had soon grown to be so unbearable that I would gladly have given up. Nothing but the fear of Alan lent me enough of a false kind of courage to continue. As for himself, and you are to bear in mind that he was cumbered with a greatcoat, he had first turned crimson, but as time went on the redness began to be mingled with patches of white. His breath cried and whistled as it came, and his voice, when he whispered his observations in my ear during our halts, sounded like nothing human. Yet he seemed in no way dashed in spirits, nor did he at all abate in his activity, so that I was driven to marvel at the man's endurance. At length, in the first gloaming of the night, we heard a trumpet sound, and looking back from among the heather, saw the troop beginning to collect. A little after, they had built a fire and camped for the night, about the middle of the waste. At this I begged and besought that we might lie down and sleep. "There shall be no sleep this night," said Alan. "From now on, these weary dragoons of yours will keep the crown to the moorland, and none will get out of Appin but winged fowls. We got through in the nick of time, and shall we jeopard what we've gained? Nah, when the day comes, it shall find you and me in a fast place on Ben Alder." "Alan," I said, "it's not the want of will, it's the strength that I want. If I could, I would, but as sure as I'm alive, I cannot." "Very well, then," said Alan, "I'll carry ye." I looked to see if he were jesting, but no, the little man was in dead earnest, and the sight of so much resolution shamed me. "Lead away," I said. "I'll follow." He gave me one look, as much to say, "Well done, David," and off he set again at his top speed. It grew cooler, and even a little darker, but not much, with the coming of the night. The sky was cloudless. It was still early in July, and pretty far north. In the darkest part of that night, you would have needed pretty good eyes to read, but for all that, I have often seen it darker in a winter midday. Heavy dew fell and drenched the moor like rain, and this refreshed me for a while. When we stopped to breathe, and I had time to see all about me, the clearness and sweetness of the night, the shapes of the hills like things asleep, and the fire dwindling away behind us like a bright spot in the midst of the moor, anger would come upon me in a clap that I must still drag myself in agony and eat the dust like a worm. But what I have read in books, I think few that have held a pen were ever really wearied, or they would write of it more strongly. I had no care of my life, neither past nor future, and I scarce remembered there was such a lad as David Balfour. I did not think of myself, but just of each fresh step which I was sure would be my last, with despair, and of Alan, who was the cause of it, with hatred. Alan was in the right trade as a soldier. This is the officer's part, to make men continue to do things, they know not wherefore, and when, if the choice was offered, they would lie down where they were and be killed. And I dare say I would have made a good enough private, for in these last hours it never occurred to me that I had any choice but just to obey as long as I was able, and die obeying. Day began to come in after years, I thought, and by that time we were past the greatest danger, and could walk upon our feet like men, instead of crawling like brutes. But, dear heart, have mercy, what a pair we must have made, going double like old grandfathers, stumbling like babes, and as white as dead folk. Never a word passed between us. Each set his mouth and kept his eyes in front of him, and lifted up his foot and set it down again, like people lifting weights to country play. And, all the while with the moorfowl crying peep in the heather, and the light coming slowly clearer in the east. I say Alan did as I did, not that I ever looked at him, for I had enough ado to keep my feet, but because it is plain he must have been as stupid with weariness as myself, and looked as little where we were going, or we should not have walked into an ambush like blind men. It fell in this way. We were going down a heathery brae, Alan leading, and I following a pace or two behind, like a fiddler and his wife, when upon a sudden the heather gave a rustle. 3 or 4 ragged men leaped out, and the next moment, we were lying on our backs, each with a dirk at his throat. I don't think I cared. The pain of this rough handling was quite swallowed up by the pains of which I was already full, and I was too glad to have stopped walking to mind about a dirk. I lay looking up in the face of the man that held me, and I mind his face was black with the sun, and his eyes very light, but I was not afraid of him. I heard Alan and another whispering in the Gaelic, and what they said was all one to me. Then the dirks were put up, our weapons were taken away, and we were set face to face, sitting in the heather. "They are Clooney's men," said Alan. "We could nae have fallen better. We're just to bide here with these, which are his out-sentries, till they can get word to the chief of my arrival." Now, Clooney Macpherson, the chief of the clan Vorich, had been one of the leaders of the great rebellion 6 years before. There was a price on his life, and I had supposed him long ago in France, with the rest of the heads of that desperate party. Even tired as I was, the surprise of what I heard half wakened me. "What?" I cried. "Is Clooney still here?" "Aye, is he so," said Alan. "Still in his own country, and kept by his own clan. King George can do no more." I think I would have asked farther, but Alan gave me the put-off. "I'm rather wearied," said he, "and I would like fine to get asleep." And without more words, he rolled on his face in a deep heather bush, and seemed to sleep at once. There was no such thing possible for me. You have heard grasshoppers whirring in the grass in the summer-time? Well, I had no sooner closed my eyes than my body, and above all my head, belly, and wrists, seemed to be filled with whirring grasshoppers, and I must open my eyes again at once, and tumble and toss, and sit up and lie down, and look at the sky which dazzled me, or at Clooney's wild and dirty sentries, peering out over the top of the brae, and chattering to each other in the Gaelic. That was all the rest I had, until the messenger returned, when, as it appeared that Clooney would be glad to receive us, we must get once more upon our feet and set forward. Alan was in excellent good spirits, much refreshed by his sleep, very hungry, and looking pleasantly forward to a dram and a dish of hot collops, of which, it seems, the messenger had brought him word. For my part, it it made me sick to hear of eating. I had been dead heavy before, and now I felt a kind of dreadful lightness which would not suffer me to walk. I drifted like a gossamer. The ground seemed to me a cloud, the hills of a featherweight, the air to have a current like a running burn, which carried me to and fro. With all that, a sort of horror of despair sat on my mind, so that I could have wept at my own helplessness. I saw Alan knitting his brows at me, and supposed it was in anger, and that gave me a pang of light-headed fear, like what a child may have. I remember, too, that I was smiling, and could not stop smiling, hard as I tried, for I thought it was out of place at such a time. But my good companion had nothing in his mind but kindness, and the next moment 2 of the gillies had me by the arms, and I began to be carried forward with great swiftness, or so it appeared to me, although I dare say it was slowly enough in truth, through a labyrinth of dreary glens and hollows, and into the heart of that dismal mountain of Ben Alder. Chapter 23. Clooney's Cage. That didn't bode well. We came at last to the foot of an exceeding steep wood, which scrambled up a craggy hillside, and was crowned by a naked precipice. "It's here," said one of the guides, and we struck uphill. The trees clung upon the slope, like sailors on the shrouds of a ship, and their trunks were like the rounds of a ladder by which we mounted. Quite at the top, and just before the rocky face of the cliff sprang above the foliage, we found that strange house which was known in the country as Clooney's Cage. The trunks of several trees had been wattled across, the intervals strengthened with stakes, and the ground behind this barricade leveled up with earth to make the floor. A tree which grew out from the hillside was the living centerbeam of the roof. The walls were of wattle and covered with moss. The whole house had something of an egg shape, and it half hung, half stood in that steep hillside thicket, like a wasp's nest in a green hawthorn. Within, it was large enough to shelter 5 or 6 persons with some comfort. A projection of the cliff had been cunningly employed to be the fireplace, and the smoke, rising against the face of the rock, and being not dissimilar in color, readily escaped notice from below. This was but one of Clooney's hiding places. He had caves besides, and underground chambers in several parts of his country, and following the reports of his scouts, he moved from one to another as the soldiers drew near or moved away. By this manner of living, and thanks to the affection of his clan, he had not only stayed all this time in safety, while so many others had fled or been taken and slain, but stayed 4 or 5 years longer, and only went to France at last by the express command of his master. There he soon died, and it is strange to reflect that he may have regretted his cage upon Ben Alder. When we came to the door, he was seated by his rock chimney, watching a gillie about some cookery. He was mighty plainly habited, with a knitted nightcap drawn over his ears, and smoked a foul cuddy pipe, for all that he had the manners of a king, and it was quite a sight to see him rise out of his place to welcome us. "Well, Mr. Stewart, come awa, sir," said he, "and bring in your friend as yet I dinna ken the name of." "And how is yourself, Clooney?" said Alan. "I hope you do brawly, sir, and I am proud to see ye, and to present to ye my friend, the Laird of Shaw's, Mr. David Balfour." Alan never referred to my estate without a touch of a sneer when we were alone, but with strangers he rang the words out like a herald. "Step in by, the both of you gentlemen," said Clooney. "I make you welcome to my house, which is a queer, rude place for certain, but one where I have entertained a royal personage, Mr. Stewart. Ye doubtless ken the personage I have in my eye. We'll take a dram for luck, and as soon as this handless man of mine has the collops ready, we'll dine and take a hand at the carts as gentlemen should. My life is a bit dry," says he, pouring out the brandy. "I see little company, and sit and twirl my thumbs, and mind upon a great day that is gone by, and weary for another great day that we all hope will be upon the road. And so, here is a toast to ye, the Restoration." Thereupon we all touched glasses and drank. I am sure I wished no ill to King George, and if he had been there himself in proper person, it's like he would have done as I did. No sooner had I taken out the dram than I felt hugely better, and could look on and listen. Still a little mistily, perhaps, but no longer with the same groundless horror and distress of mind. It was certainly a strange place, and we had a strange host. In his long hiding, Clooney had grown to have all manner of precise habits, like those of an old maid. He had a particular place where no one else must sit. The cage was arranged in a particular way, which none must disturb. Cookery was one of his chief fancies, and even while he was greeting us in, he kept an eye on the collops. It appears he sometimes visited or received visits from his wife and one or two of his nearest friends, under the cover of night, but for the more part lived quite alone, and communicated only with his sentinels and the gillies that waited on him in the cage. The first thing in the morning, one of them, who was a barber, came and shaved him, and gave him the news of the country, of which he was immoderately greedy. There was no end to his questions. He put them as earnestly as a child, and at some of the answers laughed out of all bounds of reason, and would break out again laughing at the mere memory, hours after the barber was gone. To be sure, there might have been a purpose in his questions, for though he was thus sequestered, and like the other landed gentlemen of Scotland, stripped by the late Act of Parliament of legal powers, he still exercised a patriarchal justice in his clan. Disputes were brought to him in his hiding-hole to be decided, and the men of his country, who would have snapped their fingers at the court of session, laid aside revenge and paid down money at the bare word of this forfeited and hunted outlaw. When he was angered, which was often enough, he gave his commands and breathed threats of punishment like any king, and his gillies trembled and crouched away from him like children before a hasty father. With each of them as he entered, he ceremoniously shook hands, both parties touching their bonnets at the same time in a military manner. Altogether, I had a fair chance to see some of the inner workings of a Highland clan, and this with a prescribed fugitive chief, his country conquered, the troops riding upon all sides in quest of him, sometimes within a mile of where he lay, and when the least of the ragged fellows whom he raided and threatened could have made a fortune by betraying him. On that first day, as soon as the collops were ready, Clooney gave them with his own hand a squeeze of a lemon, for he was well supplied with luxuries, and bade us draw in to our meal. They, said he, meaning the collops, are such as I gave his Royal Highness in this very house, bating the lemon juice, for at that time we were glad to get the meat, and never fashed for kitchen. Indeed, there were more dragoons than lemons in my country in the year 46. I do not know if the collops were truly very good, but my heart rose against the sight of them, and I could eat but little. All the while Clooney entertained us with stories of Prince Charlie's stay in the cage, giving us the very words of the speakers, and rising from his place to show us where they stood. By these, I gathered the prince was a gracious, spirited boy, like the son of a race of polite kings, but not so wise as Solomon. I gathered, too, that while he was in the cage, he was often drunk, so the fault that has since, by all accounts, made such a wreck of him had even then begun to show itself. We were no sooner done eating than Clooney brought out an old, thumbed, greasy pack of cards, such as you may find in a mean inn, and his eyes brightened in his face as he proposed that we should fall to playing. Now this was one of the things I had been brought up to eschew like disgrace, it being held by my father neither the part of a Christian nor yet of a gentleman to set his own livelihood and fish for that of others on the cast of painted pasteboard. To be sure, I might have pleaded my fatigue, which was excuse enough, but I thought it behooved that I should bear a testimony. I must have got very red in the face, but I spoke steadily, and told them I had no call to be a judge of others, but for my own part, it was a matter in which I had no clearness. Clooney stopped mingling the cards. "What in the deil's name is this?" says he. "What kind of Whiggish, canting talk is this for the house of Clooney Macpherson?" "I will put my hand in the fire for Mr. Balfour," says Allan. "He is an honest and a mettle gentleman, and I would have you bear in mind who says it. I bear a king's name," says he, cocking his hat, "and I and any that I call friend are company for the best. But the gentleman's tired and should sleep. If he has no mind to the carts, it will never hinder you and me. And I am fit and willing, sir, to play ye any game that ye can name." Sir, says Cluny, in this poor house of mine I would have you to ken that any gentleman may follow his pleasure. If your friend would like to stand on his head, he is welcome, and if either he or you or any other man is not precisely satisfied, I would be proud to step outside with him. I had no will that these two friends should cut their throats for my sake. Sir, said I, I'm very wearied, as Allan says, and what's more, as you are a man that likely has sons of your own, I may tell you it was a promise to my father. Say no more, said Cluny, and pointed me to a bed of heather in a corner of the cage. For all that he was displeased enough, looked at me askance, and grumbled when he looked. And indeed it must be owned that both my scruples, and the words in which I declared them, smacked somewhat of the Covenanter, and were little in their place among wild Highland Jacobites. What with the brandy and the venison, a strange heaviness had come over me, and I had scarce lain down upon the bed before I fell into a kind of trance, in which I continued almost the whole time of our stay at the cage. Sometimes I was broad awake and understood what passed. Sometimes I only heard voices, or men snoring, like the voice of a silly river, and the plaids upon the wall dwindled down and swelled out again like firelight shadows on the roof. I must sometimes have spoken or cried out, for I remember I was now and then amazed at being answered. Yet I was conscious of no particular nightmare, only of a general black abiding horror, a horror of the place I was in, and the bed I lay in, and the plaids on the wall, and the voices, and the fire, and myself. The barber Gilly, who was a doctor too, was called in to prescribe for me, but as he spoke in the Gaelic I understood not a word of his opinion, and was too sick even to ask for a translation. I knew well enough I was ill, and that was all I cared about. I paid little heed while I lay in this poor pass, but Allan and Cluny were most of the time at the cards, and I am clear that Allan must have begun by winning, for I remember sitting up and seeing them hard at it, in a great glittering pile, as much as 60 or 100 guineas on the table. It looked strange enough to see all this wealth in a nest upon a cliffside, waddled about growing trees, and even then I thought it seemed deep water for Allan to be riding, who had no better battle horse than a green purse in a matter of 5 pounds. The luck, it seems, changed on the second day. About noon I was wakened as usual for dinner, and as usual refused to eat, and was given a dram with some bitter infusion which the barber had prescribed. The sun was shining in at the open door of the cage, and this dazzled and offended me. Cluny sat at the table, biting the pack of cards. Allan had stooped over the bed and had his face close to my eyes, to which, troubled as they were with the fever, seemed of the most shocking bigness. He asked me for a loan of my money. What for? Said I. Oh, just for a loan, said he. But why? I repeated. I don't see. Hut, David, said Allan. You wouldn't have grudged me a loan. I would, though, if I had my senses. But all I thought of then was to get his face away, and I handed him my money. On the morning of the third day, when we had been 48 hours in the cage, I awoke with a great relief of spirits, very weak and weary indeed, but seeing things of the right size, and with their honest everyday appearance. I had a mind to eat, moreover, rose from bed of my own movement, and as soon as we had breakfasted, stepped to the entry of the cage, and sat down outside in the top of the wood. It was a grey day, with a cool, mild air, and I sat in a dream all morning, only disturbed by the passing by of Cluny's scouts and servants, coming with provisions and reports. For as the coast was at that time clear, you might almost say he held court openly. When I returned, he and Allan had laid the cards aside, and were questioning a gillie, and the chief turned about and spoke to me in the Gaelic. I have no Gaelic, sir, said I. Now, since the card question, everything I said or did had the power of annoying Cluny. Your name has more sense than yourself, then, said he, angrily, for it's good Gaelic. But the point is this. My scout reports all clear in the south, and the question is, have you the strength to go? I saw cards on the table, but no gold, only a heap of little written papers, and these all on Cluny's side. Allan, besides, had an odd look, like a man not very well content, and I began to have a strong misgiving. I do not know if I am as well as I should be, said I, looking at Alan, but the little money we have has a long way to carry us. Alan took his underlip into his mouth and looked upon the ground. David, says he at last, I've lost it. There's the naked truth. My money too, said I. Your money too, says Alan, with a groan. You shouldn't have given it me. I'm daft when I get to the carts. Hoot toot, said Clooney. It was all daffing. It's all nonsense. Of course you'll have your money back again, and the double of it, if you'll make so free with me. It would be a singular thing for me to keep it. It's not to be supposed that I would be any hindrance to gentlemen in your situation. That would be a singular thing, cries he, and began to pull gold out of his pocket with a mighty red face. Alan said nothing, only looked on the ground. Will you step to the door with me, sir, said I. Clooney said he would be very glad, and followed me readily enough, but he looked flustered and put out. And now, sir, says I must first acknowledge your generosity. Nonsensical nonsense, cried Clooney. Where's the generosity? This is just a most unfortunate affair. But what would you have me do? Boxed up in this bee-skip of a cage of mine, but just set my friends to the carts when I can get them. And if they lose, of course it's not to be supposed. And here he came to a pause. Yes, said I, if they lose, you give them back their money, and if they win, they carry away yours in their pouches. I have said before that I grant your generosity. But to me, sir, it's a very painful thing to be placed in this position. Hey, Alex, how was your stream? How are you doing? You were entirely too kind to me. I'm sure all of you know Alex, but please give him a shout out if you would, Bella, if you get a chance. Uh-oh. Were you starting to feel poorly, Alex? I mean, I actually reached affiliate a while ago, Alex. I just chose not to take the contract because it was a little restrictive. And I wanted to be able to multi-stream and stuff like that. So instead I set up a Patreon so people could support me. But yeah, I actually already qualified for affiliate months ago. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, when I got my shot, I was fine for like the first day or so. But then, man, the side effect I got was just pain. So much pain. It was like the pain was coming from inside my bones. It was intense. And I could just see you singing that song. It's a good song. All right. Back to the book, though. Hey, J-Math. Welcome. I'm glad you're here, too. There was a little silence, in which Clooney seemed always as if he was about to speak, but said nothing. All the time he grew redder and redder in the face. I am a young man, said I, and I ask your advice. Advise me as you would your son. My friend fairly lost his money, after having fairly gained a far greater sum of yours. Can I accept it back again? Would that be the right part for me to play? Whatever I do, you can see for yourself it must be hard upon a man of any pride. It's rather hard on me too, Mr. Balfour, said Clooney, and to give me very much the look of a man that has entrapped poor people to their hurt. I wouldn't have my friends come to any house of mine to accept affronts. No, he cried, with a sudden heat of anger, nor yet to give them. And so you see, sir, said I, there is something to be said upon my side, and this gambling is a very poor employ for gentlefolks. But I am still waiting your opinion. I am sure if ever Clooney hated any man, it was David Balfour. He looked me all over with a warlike eye, and I saw the challenge at his lips. but either my youth disarmed him, or perhaps his own sense of justice. Certainly it was a mortifying matter for all concerned, and not least Clooney, the more credit that he took it as he did. "Mr. Balfour," said he, "I think you are too nice and covenanting, but for all that, you have the spirit of a very pretty gentleman. Upon my honest word, you may take this money. It's what I would tell my son, and here's my hand along with it." I'm getting pretty close to the end of the book. Let's see, about 6 more chapters. Not sure if we'll finish today, but we'll definitely finish tomorrow. So, chapter 24, and this might be the last chapter we do today. Well, it's a pretty short one. Probably do 24 and 25 at least. The flight in the heather, the quarrel. Alan and I were put across Loch Arrocht under cloud of night, and went down its eastern shore to another hiding place near the head of Loch Rannoch, whither we were led by one of the gillies from the cage. This fellow carried all our luggage, and Alan's greatcoat in the bargain, trotting along under the burden, far less than the half of which used to weigh me to the ground, like a stout hill pony with a feather. Yet he was a man that, in plain contest, I could have broken on my knee. Doubtless it was a great relief to walk disencumbered, and perhaps without that relief, and the consequent sense of liberty and lightness, I could not have walked at all. I was but new risen from a bed of sickness, and there was nothing in the state of our affairs to hearten me for much exertion, travelling as we did over the most dismal deserts in Scotland, under a cloudy heaven and with divided hearts among the travellers. For long we said nothing, marching alongside or one behind the other, each with a set countenance. I, angry and proud, and drawing what strength I had from these two violent and sinful feelings. Alan, angry and ashamed that he had lost my money, angry that I should take it so ill. The thought of a separation ran always the stronger in my mind, and the more I approved of it, the more ashamed I grew of my approval. It would be a fine, handsome, generous thing, indeed, for Alan to turn round and say to me, "Go, I am in the most danger, and my company only increases yours." But for me to turn to the friend, who certainly loved me, and say to him, "You are in great danger, I am in but little. Your friendship is a burden. Go, take your risks, and bear your hardships alone." No, that was impossible, and even to think of it privily to myself made my cheeks to burn. And yet Alan had behaved like a child, and, what is worse, a treacherous child. Wheedling my money from me while I lay half conscious was scarce better than theft, and yet here he was trudging by my side, without a penny to his name, and by what I could see, quite blithe the sponge upon the money he had driven me to beg. True, I was ready to share it with him, but it made me rage to see him count upon my readiness. These were the two things uppermost in my mind, and I could open my mouth upon neither without black ungenerosity. So I did the next worst, and said nothing, nor so much as looked once at my companion, save with the tail of my eye. At last, upon the other side of Loch Arrocht, going over a smooth, rushy place, where the walking was easy, he could bear it no longer, and came close to me. "David," says he, "this is no way for two friends to take a small accident. I have to say that I'm sorry, and so that's said, and now, if you have anything, you'd better say it." "Oh," says I have nothing." He seemed disconcerted, at which I was meanly pleased. "No," said he, with rather a trembling voice, "but when I say I was to blame—" "Why, of course you were to blame," said I coolly, "and you will bear me out that I have never reproached you." "Never," says he, "but you ken very well that you've done worse. Are we to part? You said so once before. Are you to say it again? There's hills and heather enough between here and the two seas, David, and I will own I'm no very keen to say where I'm no wanted." This pierced me like a sword, and seemed to lay bare my private disloyalty. "Alan Breck," I cried, and then, "do you think I am one to turn my back on you in your chief need? You durst say it to my face. My whole conduct's there to give the lie to it. It's true, I fell asleep upon the moor, but that was from weariness, and you do wrong to cast it up to me." "Which is what I never did," said Alan. But aside from that, I continued, what have I done that you should even to me dogs by such a supposition? I never yet failed a friend, and it's not likely I'll begin with you. There are things between us that I can never forget, even if you can. I will only say this to you, David, said Alan, very quietly, that I have long been owing you my life, and now I owe you money. You should try to make that burden light for me. This ought to have touched me, and in a manner it did, but the wrong manner. I felt I was behaving badly, and was now not only angry with Alan, but angry with myself in the bargain, and it made me the more cruel. You asked me to speak, said I. Well, then I will. You own yourself that you have done me a disservice. I have had to swallow an affront. I have never reproached you. I never named the thing till you did. And now you blame me, cried I, because I cannot laugh and sing as if I was glad to be affronted. The next thing will be that I'm to go down upon my knees and thank you for it. You should think more of others, Alan Breck. If you thought more of others, you would perhaps speak less about yourself. And when a friend that likes you very well has passed over an offense without a word, you would be blithe to let it lie, instead of making it a stick to break his back with. By your own way of it, it was you that was to blame, then it should nae be you to seek the quarrel. Ah, weel, said Alan, say nae mair. And we fell back into our former silence, and came to our journey's end, and supped, and lay down to sleep, without another word. The gillie put us across Loch Rannoch in the dusk of the next day, and gave us his opinion as to our best route. This was to get us up at once into the tops of the mountains, to go round by a circuit, turning the heads of Glen Lyon, Glen Lochay, and Glen Dochart, and come down upon the lowlands by Kippen and the upper waters of the Forth. Alan was little pleased with a route which led us through the country of his blood foes, the Glenorchy Campbells. He objected that by turning to the east we should come almost at once among the Athol Stewarts, a race of his own name and lineage, although following a different chief, and come besides by a far easier and swifter way to the place whither we were bound. But the gillie, who was indeed the chief man of Cluny's scouts, had good reasons to give him on all hands, naming the force of troops in every district, and alleging finally, as well as I could understand, that we should nowhere be so little troubled as in a country of the Campbells. Alan gave way at last, but with only half a heart. It's one of the dowiest countries in Scotland, said he. There's naething there that I ken but heath and crows and Campbells. But I see that you're a man of some penetration, and be it as ye please. We set forth accordingly by this itinerary, and for the best part of 3 nights travelled on eerie mountains and among the well-heads of wild rivers, often buried in mist, almost continually blown and rained upon, and not once cheered by any glimpse of sunshine. By day we lay and slept in the drenching heather. By night incessantly clambered upon breakneck hills and among rude crags. We often wandered. We were often so involved in fog that we must lie quite still till it lightened. A fire was never to be thought of. Our only food was drommock and a portion of cold meat that we had carried from the cage. And as for drink, heaven knows we had no want of water. This was a dreadful time, rendered the more dreadful by the gloom of the weather in the country. I was never warm. My teeth chattered in my head. I was troubled with a very sore throat, such as I had had on the isle. I had a painful stitch in my side, which never left me, and when I slept in my wet bed, with the rain beating above and the mud oozing below me, it was to live over again in fancy the worst part of my adventures, to see the Tower of Shaws lit by lightning, Ransom carried below on the men's backs, Sean dying on the roundhouse floor, or Colin Campbell grasping at the bosom of his coat. From such broken slumbers I would be aroused in the gloaming, to sit up in the same puddle where I had slept, and sup cold drommock, the rain driving sharp in my face, or running down my back in icy trickles, the mist enfolding us like as in a gloomy chamber, or perhaps, if the wind blew, falling suddenly apart, and showing us the gulf of some dark valley where the streams were crying aloud. The sound of an infinite number of rivers came up from all round. In this steady rain, the springs of the mountain were broken up. Every glen gushed water like a cistern. Every stream was in high spate, and had filled and overflowed its channel. During our night tramps, it was solemn to hear the voice of them below in the valleys, now booming like thunder, now with an angry cry. I could well understand the story of the water kelpie, that demon of the streams, who was fabled to keep wailing and roaring at the ford until the coming of the doomed traveler. Alan, I saw, believed it, or half believed it, and when the cry of the river rose more than usually sharp, I was little surprised, though of course I would still be shocked, to see him cross himself in the manner of the Catholics. "Hey, little dude, how are you? Are you liking the story?" During all these horrid wanderings, we had no familiarity, scarcely even that of speech. The truth is that I was sickening for my grave, which is my best excuse. But besides that, I was an unforgiving disposition from my birth, slow to take offense, slow to forget it, and now incensed both against my companion and myself. For the best part of 2 days he was unweariedly kind, silent indeed, but always ready to help, and always hoping, as I could well see, that my displeasure would blow by. For the same length of time I stayed in myself, nursing my anger, roughly refusing his services, and passing him over with my eyes as if he had been a bush or a stone. The second night, or rather the peep of the third day, found us upon a very open hill, so that we could not follow our usual plan and lie down immediately to eat and sleep. Before we had reached a place of shelter, the gray had come pretty clear, for though it still rained, the clouds ran higher, and Alan, looking in my face, showed some marks of concern. "You had better let me take your pack," said he, for perhaps the 9th time since we had parted from the scout beside Loch Rannoch. "I do very well, I thank you," said I, as cold as ice. Alan flushed darkly. "I'll not offer it again," he said. "I'm not a patient man, David." "I never said you were," said I, which was exactly the rude, silly speech of a boy of 10. Alan made no answer at the time, but his conduct answered for him. Henceforth, it is to be thought, he quite forgave himself for the affair at Cluny's, cocked his hat again, walked jauntily, whistled airs, and looked at me upon one side with a provoking smile. The third night we were to pass through the western end of the country of Balquhidder. It came clear and cold, with a touch in the air like frost, and a northerly wind that blew the clouds away and made the stars bright. The streams were full, of course, and still made a great noise among the hills, but I observed that Alan thought no more upon the kelpie, and was in high good spirits. As for me, the change of weather came too late. I had lain in the mire so long that, as the Bible has it, my very clothes abhorred me. I was dead weary, deadly sick, and full of pains and shiverings. The chill of the wind went through me, and the sound of it confused my ears. In this poor state I had to bear from my companion something in the nature of a persecution. He spoke a good deal, and never without a taunt. Whig was the best name he had to give me. "Here," he would say, "here's a dub for you to jump, my Wiggy. I ken you're a fine jumper," and so on, all the time with a jibing voice and face. I knew it was my own doing, and no one else's, but I was too miserable to repent. I felt I could drag myself but little farther. Pretty soon I must lie down and die on these wet mountains, like a sheep or a fox, and my bones must whiten there like the bones of a beast. My head was light, perhaps, but I began to love the prospect. I began to glory in the thought of such a death, alone in the desert, with the wild eagles besieging my last moments. Alan would repent then, I thought. He would remember, when I was dead, how much he owed me, and the remembrance would be torture. So I went, like a sick, silly, and bad-hearted schoolboy, feeding my anger against a fellow man, when I would have been better on my knees, crying on God for mercy. And at each of Alan's taunts I hugged myself. "Ah," thinks I to myself, "I have a better taunt in readiness, when I lie down and die. You will feel it like a buffet in your face. Ah, what a revenge! Ah, how you will regret your ingratitude and cruelty." All the while, I was growing worse and worse. Once I had fallen, my leg simply doubling under me, and this had struck Alan for the moment. But I was afoot so briskly, and set off again with such a natural manner, that he soon forgot the instant. Flushes of heat went over me, and then spasms of shuddering. The stitch in my side was hardly bearable. At last I began to feel that I could trail myself no farther. And with that, there came on me all at once the wish to have it out with Alan, let my anger blaze, and be done with my life in a more sudden manner. He had just called me Whig. I stopped. "Mr. Stewart," said I, in a voice that quivered like a fiddle string, "you are older than I am, and should know your manners. Do you think it either very wise or very witty to cast my politics in my teeth? I thought, where folk differed, it was the part of gentlemen to differ civilly, and if I did not, I may tell you I could find a better taunt than some of yours." Alan had stopped opposite to me, his hat cocked, his hands in his breeches pockets, his head on a little on one side. He listened, smiling evilly, as I could see by the starlight, and when I had done, he began to whistle a Jacobite air. It was the air made in mockery of General Cope's defeat at Preston Pans. "Hey, Johnny Cope, are you walking yet? And are your drums a-beating yet?" And it came into my mind that Alan, on the day of that battle, had been engaged upon the royal side. "Why do you take that air, Mr. Stewart?" said I. "Is that to remind me that you have been beaten on both sides?" The air stopped on Alan's lips. "David," said he. "But it's time these manners ceased," I continued, "and I mean you shall henceforth speak civilly of my king and my good friends the Campbells." "I am a Stewart," began Alan. "Oh," says I ken you bear a king's name, but you are to remember, since I have been in the Highlands, I have seen a good many of those that bear it, and the best I can say of them is this, that they would be none the worse of washing." "Do you know that you insult me?" said Alan, very low. "I am sorry for that," said I, "for I am not done, and if you distaste the sermon, I doubt the perlique will please you as little. You have been chased in the field by the grown men of my party. It seems a poor kind of pleasure to outface a boy. Both the Campbells and the Whigs have beaten you. You have run before them like a hare. It behooves you to speak of them as your betters." Alan stood quite still, the tails of his greatcoat clapping behind him in the wind. "This is a pity," he said at last. "There are things said that cannot be passed over." "I never asked you to," said I. "I am as ready as yourself." "Ready," said he. "Ready," I repeated. "I am no blower and boaster like some that I could name. Come on!" And drawing my sword, I fell on guard as Alan himself had taught me. "David," he cried, "are ye daft? I cannot draw on ye. David, it's fair murder." "That was your lookout when you insulted me," said I. "It's the truth," cried Alan, and he stood for a moment, wringing his mouth in his hand, like a man in sore perplexity. "It's the bare truth," he said, and drew his sword. But before I could touch his blade with mine, he had thrown it from him and fallen to the ground. Nah, he kept saying. Nah, I canna. At this, the last of my anger oozed all out of me, and I found myself only sick and sorry and blank, and wondering at myself. I would have given the world to take back what I had said, but a word once spoken, who can recapture it? It minded me of all Alan's kindness and courage in the past, how he had helped and cheered and borne with me in our evil days, and then recalled my own insults, and saw that I had lost forever that doughty friend. At the same time, the sickness that hung upon me seemed to redouble, and the pang in my side was like a sword for sharpness. I thought I must have swooned where I stood. This it was that gave me a thought. No apology could blot out what I had said. It was needless to think of one. None could cover the offense. But where an apology was vain, a mere cry for help might bring Alan back to my side. I put my pride away from me. "Alan," I said, "if you canna help me, I must just die here." He started up sitting and looked at me. "It's true," said I. "I'm by with it. Oh, let me get into the bield of a house. I can die there easier." I had no need to pretend. Whether I chose or not, I spoke in a weeping voice that would have melted a heart of stone. "Can you walk?" asked Alan. "No," said I, "not without help. This last hour my legs have been fainting under me. I've a stitch in my side like a red-hot iron. I cannot breathe right. If I die, you can forgive me, Alan. In my heart I liked you fine, even when I was the angriest." Wheesht, cried Alan. "Dinna say that. David, man, ye ken—" He shut his mouth upon a sob. Let me get my arm about you, he continued. That's the way. Now lean upon me hard. Good kins where there's a house. We're in Baldwidder too. There should be no want of houses. No, nor friends' houses there. Do you gang easier so, Davy? Hey, Meg. You have a good night. Sleep well. Dream of wonderful things and great stories and whatnot. I'm glad you're back and I'm glad you're streaming again. I missed you while you were gone. You missed you too? I'm very glad you're back. But have a really good night. Sleep well. said I can be doing this way, and I pressed his arm with my hand. Again he came near sobbing. Davy, said he, I'm no a right man at all. I've neither sense nor kindness. I couldna remember you when you were just a barn. I couldna see you were dying on your feet. Davy, you'll have to try and forgive me. Oh, man, let's say no more about it, said I. We're neither one of us to mend the other. That's the truth. We must just bear and forbear, man, Allen. Oh, but my stitch is sore. Is there nae house? I'll find a house to you, David, he said stoutly. We'll follow down the burn, where there's bound to be houses. My poor man, will you no be better on my back? Oh, Allen, says I, and me a good 12 inches taller. You're no such thing, cried Allen, with a start. There may be a trifling matter of an inch or two. I'm no saying I'm just exactly what you would call a tall man, whatever, and I dare say, he added, his voice tailing off in a laughable manner. Now, when I come to think of it, I dare say you'll be just about right. Aye, it'll be a foot, or near hand, or maybe even more. It was sweet and laughable to hear Allen eat his words up in the fear of some fresh quarrel. I could have laughed, had not my stitch caught me so hard. But if I had laughed, I think I must have wept too. Allen, cried I, what makes you so good to me? What makes you care for such a thankless fellow? Deed, and I don't know, said Allen, for just precisely what I thought I liked about ye was that ye never quarrelled, and now I like ye better. All right, and my throat is getting super sore, so we're going to close there. We're just at about the 2-hour mark anyway. But thank you everybody for joining me. I really appreciate it. I hope you all enjoyed the story, and I hope you'll join me for the conclusion of this book tomorrow at the same time. It'll be 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you liked it and you haven't yet, please do click that purple follow button and join the Discord if you get a chance. Come hang out, talk with us. I'll be on there for a while yet. I'm probably going to play a game with whoever wants to jump in and play some games or something. But I'm definitely going to get a throat lozenge and try and get my throat to quit being on fire quite so much. It always gets like more sore when I take a week or so off from reading. More tea. Yeah, I ran all out of the pot of tea. But anyway, thank you everyone for coming to join me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the story. And if you have any requests for the next story, please put them in the book request channel. I'll be looking there for what we'll be reading starting Wednesday, I think. So, have an excellent evening, morning, afternoon, whatever it happens to be, wherever you are. Good night to you.